These are the heroes of the faith. We read about them in the Bible. One of the greatest heroes of the faith is a man named Moses. We talk about him 3,000 years later because he was a man who had zero compromise in his faith. In fact, this morning, we're going to read a story about him, and we're going to see how he was tempted to compromise and how he refused and why his life had power. And we're going to learn how to live in the same kind of victory and power that Moses did. Exodus chapter 8 is where we're going to be jumping in halfway through. Open your Bible, if you will. Those of you who are guests, second book of the Bible. You got Genesis and Exodus chapter 8. We're going to start in a moment in verse 16. But every Sunday we have guests who are with us or watching online, so let me give you a recap. It won't take long, but I want to make sure we're all caught up. So you have the Hebrew people, the Israelites, and they're slaves in the land of Egypt. And God has raised up Moses to go liberate them. So he's supposed to go before Pharaoh and say, Pharaoh, let the people of God go so they can worship Yahweh. And Pharaoh, as you know, refuses, says, I'm not going to let you go. And so God brings upon some plagues over Pharaoh. There are going to be 10 of them. We've covered 2 so far. A few weeks ago, we looked at how Moses and Aaron turned the Nile River into blood. And then last week, we talked about the plague of frogs that came upon them. This week, we're going to move on into the 3rd and 4th plagues. And we're going to learn even more about what God is after in these plagues and how he's trying to prove to us he is the only one to be trusted. So with that in mind, let's jump into the 3rd plague, the plague of gnats, beginning in verse 16. Here's what it says. It says, Then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth so that it may become gnats in all the land of Egypt. And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt. The magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Okay, so this is the shortest of all the 10 plagues. Just a few little verses right here that describe this plague of gnats. But it's the shortest one for sure, but it is one of the most potent when you understand what's really going on. So, like I mentioned last week with the plague of frogs, sometimes we look at these plagues and we miss the severity of them. So when you think about a plague of gnats, the first thing you think about is a swarm of gnats, like around you that you're gonna kind of like, get away from me. You've walked into a swarm of gnats before, I'm certain. And it's super annoying, but it's not deadly. Like maybe you choke one down, but you're not gonna die, a little extra protein, you'll be all right. But it's annoying, not deadly. And you're going, okay, of all the things, like why not a plague of lions that come in and devour people? Why a plague of gnats? And it's really understanding what that word means that gives you some of the gravity to it. So most scholars believe it's not referring to the normal gnat that you and I would think of. That word is fairly ambiguous in the Hebrew. But because it says that they were, in verse 18, that they were on man and beast, most scholars believe that it was actually much worse. More than likely, it was at worst, or at best, it was mosquitoes. At worst, it was fleas or lice. A plague of fleas or lice. Yeah, I'm going, mess you up thinking about that. There was a historian in the 1st century AD, a guy named Philo of Alexandria, and he's a Jewish historian writing about the plagues, and he says this 2,000 years ago. He describes these insects, whatever they are, as the kind of insects that would crawl up in your nose and nest in your ears. Ah! Like that's a whole lot worse than little pesky gnats going by. These were terrible, to the point that the magicians are freaking out a bit. Interesting little side bit about this particular plague. This is the first one that the magicians cannot recreate. If you've been tracking along, you know there was a sign that was originally done early on in chapter 7 where Aaron threw down his staff and it turned into a snake. And then it says the Egyptian magicians were able to recreate it. They threw down their staffs and they became snakes. They did it by their secret arts. And then right after that, you had the first plague, the plague of turning the Nile River into blood. And it says that the magicians, by their secret arts, were able to turn water into blood. I don't know how, but they were able to do it. And then the plague of frogs that we looked at last week, it says that they brought frogs out of the water, and it says the magicians were able to bring frogs out of the water. So far, they're 3 for 3, producing these exact same miracles until you get to the plague of gnats. And for the first time, it says the magicians were not able to recreate this miracle. Now, I got to be honest with you. I don't fully know. I can't tell you with complete certainty exactly what's going on, how they've been able to recreate the sign in the first 2 plagues. But I believe, because of the terminology in Hebrew, that this is a representation of demonic power. The main reason I believe it is because the word that's translated in the ESV as secret arts also means enchantments or the occult. So as I'm reading that, I'm thinking, okay, the occult. It's talking about demonic forces. If you ever want to read more about that, go to Ephesians chapter 6. Talk about the war we have with demonic forces, the powers and principalities. Real forces that have real power that can do things beyond what humans can do. And so I believe demonic forces are making these happen. And so what this is showing us is that there is a genuine power, but a limited power that Satan has on earth. And that's exceptionally important. I told you from the very first sermon of this, back in Exodus chapter 1, that the real power behind Pharaoh was the devil. He was trying to keep God's people from receiving God's blessings because he didn't want them praising God. He wanted the praise for himself. So Satan's the real power behind Pharaoh. So it makes sense that the demonic forces are the power behind these Egyptian gods. And what God is showing us when the magicians are not able to recreate this is, yes, they have power, but they're 2 out of 10. That's the only 2 plagues they can recreate are the first 2. The next 8 they cannot recreate. Satan has power, but his power is limited. Go read your Bible. Read about the devil, and you'll see how many times it mentions his limited power. He can do nothing without first getting permission from the Father. He is controlled by that because he can only accomplish God's purposes even if he doesn't realize he's doing it. Think about the cross, murdering the Son of God. He has power to do that, but he doesn't realize that's all of the Father's plan. He only has power that's been given to him by God. His power is limited. It's super important that we understand that because it controls the way we view our personal battle with Satan.